In 1880, a gunmaker on the north side of Princes Street in Edinburgh filed a patent that should have changed everything. The action he designed had no flat surfaces, no sharp angles, no exposed screws on the face. The receiver was round-machined in a continuous curve from a single billet of steel so clean in its geometry that engineers who examined it decades later could not identify a simpler way to achieve the same result. It was, by any mechanical measure, the most elegant shotgun action ever conceived in the British Isles. Purdy did not build it. Holland did not build it. Boss and Company did not build it. A Scotsman built it, in Edinburgh. 330 miles from the London trade that defined what a best gun was supposed to be. And then for the better part of a century, almost no one outside Scotland knew his name. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of the gunmakers, the craftsmen, and the decisions that built or nearly destroyed the world's most important firearms workshops. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins in Edinburgh in the year 1820. Edinburgh in the 1820s was not a gun-making city in the way that Birmingham was a gun-making city, or the way that Liège in the industrial valley of eastern Belgium had been producing military arms since the 17th century. Edinburgh was something different. It was a city of law, of medicine, of philosophy, the capital of a nation that had spent 2 centuries negotiating its relationship with the larger kingdom to the south. Its craftsmen did not work in factory sheds beside canal wharves. They worked in stone-fronted workshops on streets where advocates and physicians kept their offices. The trade they served was not the army quartermaster or the export merchant. It was the landed gentry of Scotland, the lairds and earls and clan chiefs who owned the grouse moors of Perthshire, the deer forests of Sutherland, the pheasant coverts of Aberdeenshire men for whom a well-made gun was not a luxury. It was a working tool used hard across some of the most demanding terrain in the British Isles. Into this world, John Dickson was born in 1794. The historical record of his early years is thin as it is for most craftsmen of his generation. What the surviving Edinburgh trade directories confirm is this: by the early 1820s, Dickson had established himself as a working gunmaker in the city, operating from premises in the Old Town district at a time when the New Town, the grid of Georgian terraces laid out north of the Castle Ridge, was still drawing the professional classes away from the medieval closes and wynds of the original settlement. He was not a gentleman. He was a tradesman, in the precise Scottish sense of the word, a man who worked with his hands and whose reputation was entirely determined by what those hands produced. The craft he had learned was gun-making in its most demanding form, not the assembly of bought-in components, which was how most provincial gun traders in Britain operated, but the full construction of a firearm from raw material. That distinction matters. In the British gun-making trade of the early 19th century, the majority of what was sold as made guns were, in fact, assembled from parts purchased from specialist subcontractors, barrel forgers, lock filers, stock carvers, furniture casters, and then finished regulated and stamped with the retailer's name. A gunmaker who could undertake the entire process from raw iron and walnut, blank, to a regulated proofed finished arm was a different kind of craftsman entirely. Dickson was that kind of craftsman. By one account preserved in the Edinburgh gun-making trade records of the period, he had served a full apprenticeship in the mechanical construction and regulation of sporting arms before opening his own establishment. The specific master to whom he was apprenticed has not been confirmed in surviving records. What is confirmed is that by 1820 he was trading independently, which under the conventions of the Edinburgh craft guilds required a demonstrable standard of technical competence before a man could present himself to the public as a maker rather than a repairer. The market he entered was smaller than London's and more precisely defined. Scotland's sporting culture in the 1820s revolved almost entirely around the great Highland and Lowland estates, and the men who owned them had opinions about their guns that were formed by direct experience rather than by fashion. A grouse moor in August, driven in wet weather across open moorland at altitude, punished a poorly regulated gun in ways that a pheasant covert in the south of England did not. The bores had to be true. The locks had to be fast. The balance had to allow a shooter to mount the gun cleanly on a fast-crossing bird in wind on uneven ground, without thinking about the mechanics of the tool in his hands. A gun that failed those tests did not get a second commission from a Scottish lad. Word travelled. Reputations were made slowly and destroyed quickly. What did not yet exist in Edinburgh in the 1820s was a gunmaker of sufficient standing to be considered the peer of the London houses of Joseph Manton, whose name had come to define the English best gun, or of Purdy, then establishing on Oxford Street the workshop that would become the most famous sporting gun address in the world. Edinburgh had working gunmakers. It did not yet have a gunmaker whose name carried weight beyond the Scottish borders. That was the gap John Dickson identified, not by strategy, by craft. A gun either performed on the hill or it did not. His, by the evidence of the order books that survived from the 1830s and 1840s, consistently did. By the mid-1830s, Dickson had moved his premises to the new town, establishing at an address in the Frederick Street and Rose Street district that would become the fixed center of the Dickson trade for generations. The workshop was modest by London standards. Records suggest no more than a handful of craftsmen in the early years, producing perhaps 30 to 40 guns annually at a time when the larger London houses were building several hundred. But output was never the measure by which a Scottish bespoke gunmaker was judged. The measure was the gun itself. In 1838, John Dickson received his first royal warrant, an appointment as gun and rifle maker to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a title that carried formal recognition of technical standing and opened doors within the upper tier of the British sporting establishment. It was the first public confirmation that Dickson's work had been examined by men with the means to commission from anyone, and the knowledge to tell the difference. He was 44 years old. He'd been working for 2 decades. The warrant was not a breakthrough. It was a verdict. By the 1870s, the British sporting gun trade was in the middle of the most consequential engineering transition it had ever experienced. For the previous 2 centuries, the dominant mechanism in a British sporting gun had been the flintlock and then the percussion lock systems in which the shooter loaded each barrel from the muzzle tamping powder and shot down a fixed tube with a ramrod before the gun could be fired. A driven grouse shoot in Perthshire, where birds crossed the butts in rapid succession at 30 yards and more, exposed the limitations of that system with brutal clarity. By the time a shooter had reloaded, the covey was gone. The breech loader changed that. A gun that opened at the breech that accepted a self-contained cartridge, a brass case holding primer powder and shot in a single unit inserted from the rear of the barrel, rather than tamped down the muzzle, could be reloaded in under 3 seconds. The first practical breech-loading shotguns reached the British market in the 1860s. The transition was not gradual. Within a single decade, the muzzle loader was obsolete for driven game shooting. Every significant British gunmaker responded to that transition. The question was not whether to build a breech loader. The question was what kind of breech loader to build. The dominant answer by the mid-1870s was the side lock, a mechanism in which the lockwork, the springs and tumblers and sears that governed the firing sequence, was mounted on flat plates fitted to either side of the stock behind and below the action body. A side lock could be removed from the gun without tools for cleaning. Its components were accessible. Its geometry was familiar to every trained gunmaker in Britain. Purdy built side locks. Holland and Holland built side locks. Boss and Company built side locks. The side lock was in every commercial and practical sense the established answer. John Dickson Son. By the 1870s, the firm was operating under that name, John Dickson Son, John Jr. Having entered the business, chose a different answer entirely. What they designed and filed for patent protection in 1879, the patent granted and published in 1880, was a mechanism that the trade would come to call the round action. The principle requires explanation because the physical reality of it is what makes the engineering achievement comprehensible. In a conventional box lock action, the simpler, cheaper alternative to the side lock that had emerged in the 1870s, the lockwork is housed inside a rectangular action body. The body has flat sides, a flat bottom, sharp internal corners. It is efficient and manufacturable, but it is not elegant, and the flat-sided geometry creates stress concentration points at the corners of the action body under the repeated shock of firing. In a sidelock, the action body itself is relatively simple, a flat-sided receiver into which the barrels lock, while the mechanical complexity lives on the removable side plates. The elegance is in the lockwork. The body remains angular. What the Dickson round action did was different from both. The action body, the central steel component into which the barrels hinge, in which the firing mechanism lives and around which the stock is fitted, was machined in a continuous curve. Round in cross-section, no flat sides, no sharp internal corners, no visible screws on the action face. The lockwork was contained entirely within the rounded receiver approached from below through a trigger plate that could be removed for cleaning, leaving the exterior of the action as a single unbroken curve of polished steel. The mechanical consequence was significant. A round cross-section distributes the stress of firing across the entire circumference of the action wall, rather than concentrating it at corners. The Dickson action in theory and in the testimony of the gunsmiths who worked on it was structurally stronger for its material weight than either the box lock or the side lock it was competing against. The aesthetic consequence was more immediate. The round action gun, when stocked in best-grade English walnut and finished to Dickson's standard, had a profile unlike anything else in the British trade. It did not look like a Purdy. It did not look like a Holland. It looked like itself a continuous, uninterrupted line from the heel of the stock through the action body to the barrels, as if the gun had been carved from a single piece of material rather than assembled from components. The price reflected the complexity of achieving that result. Producing a round action required a gunmaker to machine a curved interior to fit lockwork components inside a receiver, with no flat reference surfaces, using hand-fitting techniques of exceptional precision at a time when every other maker in Britain was standardizing on flat-sided actions that could be more readily produced and regulated. By one estimate, preserved in the Dickson workshop records of the period, the round action required significantly more hand-fitting time than a comparable side lock of equivalent quality. The production rate was never high. It could not be. In the early 1880s, a Dickson round action gun in a standard game specification sold for approximately 30 to 35 pounds a figure, broadly comparable to a best-grade London sidelock from a second-tier maker, but substantially less than a Purdy, which by that period commanded £50 and above for a pair of matched guns. The pricing reflected both the quality of the work and the commercial reality. Edinburgh was not London, and a Dickson, however fine, could not yet command the premium that the London address alone conveyed. The first confirmed clients for the round action included several of the major Scottish landowning families, names from the Perthshire and Aberdeenshire estate records that appear in Dickson's surviving order books from the 1880s. The gun also attracted attention from officers of the Scottish regiments, for whom a Dickson represented a specifically Scottish choice in a market where English makers dominated the officer class. By the mid-1880s, the round action had reached clients in Ireland and in the north of England. The Edinburgh address was for the first time in the firm's history becoming known to buyers who had never set foot in Scotland. The patent provided a measure of protection. No other maker could legally produce a gun on the Dickson round-action principle for the duration of the patent's term. In a trade where design imitation was routine, where a successful innovation at one London house was typically replicated with minor variation by its competitors. Within a few seasons, the round-action remained exclusively Dickson's. That exclusivity was not merely commercial. It was the mechanism by which a Scottish gunmaker working outside the London trade hierarchy established an identity that the London houses could not absorb or replicate. The patent was not paperwork. It was the only moat Edinburgh had. The 3 decades between 1880 and 1914 were the high watermark of the British-driven game shoot, and therefore of the British best gun trade, and John Dickson Son rose with that tide in a way that no Edinburgh maker had ever managed before. To understand what the firm was selling into it is necessary to understand what a Victorian Highland shooting estate actually was. The great sporting estates of Scotland, assembled through the enclosure of common land, the clearance of tenant farming populations, and the deliberate rewilding of hillsides for red grouse and red deer had by the 1880s become the leisure infrastructure of the British ruling class. Invitations to shoot on the moors of Sutherland or the driven partridge grounds of Angus were not casual social arrangements. They were mechanisms of political alliance, commercial negotiation, and dynastic display. A man who could field a matched pair of best guns and use them with competence on a driven grouse day was signaling something precise about his standing in the world. The gun was not incidental to that signal. It was part of it. The estates that surrounded Edinburgh and the Edinburgh legal and mercantile families who owned or leased them formed Dickson's primary client base through the 1880s and 1890s. But the round action's reputation had by then begun to travel beyond Scotland in ways the firm's earlier work never had. The order books of the period, partially preserved in the National Records of Scotland and referenced in subsequent histories of the Edinburgh Gun Trade Record commissions from clients in Ireland, in the English Midlands and North, and from British colonial administrators on home leave who had come to Edinburgh specifically to examine the round action before ordering. By the early 1890s, the firm had supplied guns to several members of the Scottish aristocracy whose names appear in the social columns of the period commissions that carried the same function for an Edinburgh gunmaker that a royal warrant supplied to a London house, public confirmation that the work had been examined by men of the highest standing and found equal to any competitors. The gun that generated that reputation deserves a precise physical description because the reputation was entirely earned by the object itself. A standard Dickson round action game gun of the 1890s was built to a 12-bore specification, 12-bore referring to the internal diameter of the barrel. A measurement derived from the number of spherical lead balls of that diameter required to make 1 pound in weight, 12. In this case, producing a barrel of approximately 18.5 millimeters, internal diameter, the standard for British-driven game shooting. The barrels, typically 28 or 30 inches in length, were joined at the breech end by a rib of steel running between them regulated by the Dickson craftsman to ensure that both barrels shot to the same point of aim at a specified distance. The joining and regulation of barrels, the process of ensuring that 2 tubes of steel, each producing a column of shot moving at over 1,000 feet per second, converged on a single point, was among the most exacting operations in the entire gun-making trade. It was done by eye, by feel, and by the accumulated judgment of a craftsman who had spent years at that specific task. The action body beneath those barrels was the round-action receiver machined from a solid billet of best Sheffield steel internally fitted with the lockwork that governed the firing sequence, the hammers, the sears, the mainsprings, and the ejector mechanism that flung the spent cartridge cases clear of the breech the instant the gun was opened after firing. The ejector mechanism on a best London or Edinburgh gun of this period was itself a marvel of compact engineering, a system of levers and springs housed in the knuckle of the action where the barrels hinged, timed to eject the fired case and only the fired case leaving an unfired cartridge in place if one barrel had misfired in the fraction of a second between the gun opening and the shooter's hand reaching for fresh ammunition. On the Dickson, all of that mechanism lived inside the curved receiver. There was nothing on the outside of the action face except polished steel and the circular profile that gave the gun its name. The stock was fitted in the English style, straight hand grip splinter fore-end in best grade English walnut, selected for figure and density, shaped to the individual measurements of the client's hand length of pull cast and drop at heel and comb, determined by a tri-gun fitting at the Edinburgh workshop. No 2 stocks were identical. Every gun was, in the precise sense of the word, bespoke. Production through the 1890s is estimated at between 40 and 60 guns per year, a figure consistent with a workshop of perhaps 6 to 8 craftsmen working at full capacity on bespoke commissions. The London houses at their peak produced more Purdy, was building upward of 150 guns per year by the Edwardian period. Holland somewhat fewer, but with a broader catalogue of rifle and express work. Dickson made no attempt to compete on volume. The round action was not a product that volume production could have served. In 1893, the firm received a royal warrant of appointment as gun and rifle makers to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The formal recognition that placed Dickson in the same category of royal supplier as Purdy and Holland, and the single most significant commercial endorsement the Edinburgh trade had ever produced. The warrant was displayed on the Frederick Street shop front. It was also, for the first time, something that clients in London and the south of England had reason to notice. What the warrant confirmed was what the guns themselves had been saying for a decade, that the standard of work produced in Edinburgh by a family firm that had never courted the London trade or sought premises in Mayfair was equal to anything the metropolitan establishment could offer, and that in one specific and unmistakable respect the Dickson round action was superior to anything London had produced, because London had never produced anything like it. Through the Edwardian period, the years between Victoria's death in 1901 and the outbreak of war in August 1914, the Scottish-driven game season reached a scale it would never again achieve. House parties at the great Highland lodges lasted weeks. Loaders were retained by name from season to season. Cartridge consumption on a single driven grouse day on a productive Perthshire moor could exceed 1,000 rounds across a line of 8 guns. The demand on those guns, the mechanical stress of sustained rapid fire, the fouling of black powder residue, replaced now by the cleaner but no less demanding cordite propellant. The weather of a Scottish August, which combined driving rain with sudden cold, was a continuous and unforgiving test of every joint, every spring, every fitted surface in the action. The round action passed that test season after season on moors, from Caithness to the Borders. The guns that came back to Frederick Street for annual service showed in the testimony of the craftsmen who opened them the characteristic wear patterns of guns that had been used hard and maintained properly, the marks of working tools rather than cabinet pieces. Then, in the 4th week of July, 1914, the invitations for the August season began to be cancelled. Within 6 weeks, the country was at war. The August 1914 grouse season, the first day of which was the glorious 12th. The 12th of August, the date by which every Scottish shooting lodge had traditionally been staffed and stocked and readied, did not take place. The loaders enlisted, the keepers enlisted. The sons of the families who had stood in those butts for 30 years enlisted, or were commissioned, or were called up under the terms of mobilization that moved faster than anyone in Edinburgh or London or the Highland estates had believed possible in the final days of peace. For John Dickson Son, the war arrived as a sudden and total interruption of everything the firm had been built to do. The bespoke sporting gun commission, a transaction that required a client to visit the workshop, be measured on the try-gun discuss specification over a period of weeks, and then wait 18 months to 2 years for the finished gun, did not survive the transition to a wartime economy. The clients were not there. The craftsmen who remained in the workshop, those above military age or retained in reserved occupations, redirected their skills to the repair and overhaul of military arms, passing through Edinburgh, to the proofing and regulation of service weapons, to the maintenance work that a city with a significant military garrison continuously generated. No confirmed production figures survive for the Dickson workshop between 1914 and 1918. What the trade records of the Edinburgh gun-making industry suggest is that bespoke civilian production effectively ceased across the Scottish trade for the duration. The machines were the same. The hands that had run them were in many cases in France. The craftsmen who did not return from the Western Front carried with them knowledge that could not be reconstructed from a manual or a drawing. The specific hand skills required to fit the Dickson round action to machine and regulate a curved interior to the tolerances that the mechanism demanded were not widely held even within the Edinburgh trade. They were held by individuals, and individuals in the years between 1914 and 1918 were not guaranteed to survive. The guns that had been built before the war continued to shoot. On the moors that still operated with reduced parties and shorter seasons, the pre-war Dickson round actions performed exactly as they had been built to perform. The steel remembered nothing of what had happened in the intervening years. The craftsmen who had shaped it would not all be coming back. The world that had sustained John Dickson Son for 90 years did not end on Armistice Day. It ended more slowly than that across 3 decades of fiscal attrition, social displacement, and the quiet, irreversible contraction of the landed class that had formed the firm's entire client base since 1820. The mechanism of that contraction was not dramatic. It was legislative. The Finance Act of 1894 had introduced estate duties, a graduated tax on the transfer of property at death, at rates that the largest Scottish landowners could absorb with difficulty from rental income and timber sales. But the Finance Act of 1919, passed by a government attempting to service the debt of a 4-year industrial war, doubled those rates. And the Finance Act of 1925 doubled them again, a Scottish estate that had passed intact through 4 generations. The same estate whose owners had stood in Dickson's workshop on Frederick Street, being measured on the tri-gun ordering pairs of round-action guns for the August season, was now at each generational transfer subject to duties that could amount to 40% of its assessed value. The mathematics were unambiguous. Estates were broken up. Shooting rights were let rather than reserved for family use. The lodge that had housed 12 guns for 3 weeks in August was now leased to a syndicate or sold outright or left empty while the family retreated to a smaller house on the reduced acreage they could still afford to maintain. The bespoke gun commission followed the estate. When a family could no longer afford to shoot at the scale their fathers had the order for a new pair of best guns did not arrive at Frederick Street. Dickson survived the interwar years, but not at the scale or the pace of the Edwardian period. Production contracted. The workforce contracted with it. The order books of the 1920s and 1930s, where they survive, show a firm still capable of producing round-action guns of the same technical standard as before the war, but doing so at a rate that by some estimates had fallen to fewer than 20 guns per year. By the mid-1930s, a third of the pre-war output serving a client base that was itself a fraction of what it had been in 1910. The Second World War compressed the contraction further. In September 1939, the pattern of 1914 repeated itself, but with less surprise and no less consequence. Civilian bespoke production ceased again. The Edinburgh workshop redirected to military support work. A second generation of craftsmen, the sons and nephews of the men who had been lost or aged out in the First War, now faced the same interruption, the same suspension of the work they had trained to do, the same uncertainty about what would remain when it was over. What remained after 1945 was a country that had spent 6 years on a war footing and had neither the appetite nor the economic conditions for the immediate resumption of luxury commission work. The Labour government, elected in July 1945, introduced a program of taxation and nationalisation that further compressed the disposable incomes of the landed class. The driven game shoot did not disappear, but it contracted sharply, and the clients who continued to shoot did so, with guns already in the cabinet rather than new commissions placed with Edinburgh or London makers. For Dickson, the post-war decade was the most dangerous the firm had yet faced. Not because of competition, not because of a failed product or a lost contract, but because of arithmetic. A round-action gun required a craftsman who understood the round action. That understanding was not transferable by instruction alone. It lived in the hands, in the specific motor memory of a man who had spent years fitting curved surfaces to curved receivers, regulating ejectors in a mechanism with no flat reference face, stocking a gun whose action body offered none of the angular reference points that made conventional gun fitting straightforward. The number of craftsmen in Edinburgh who held that knowledge in 1950 could be counted on one hand. When those men retired or died, the knowledge retired and died with them unless it had been passed in the traditional manner of the craft to an apprentice who had stood beside them long enough to absorb what could not be written down. The London houses faced versions of the same problem, but they faced it from a position of greater scale, greater capital, and greater international visibility. Purdy, acquired by the Vesti Group in 1946, had the resources to invest in maintaining its craft base through the lean post-war years. Holland and Holland similarly retained sufficient institutional depth to weather the contraction without losing the core skills that defined its product. Dickson had no such resources. It had the round action of Frederick Street address and a dwindling number of men who knew how to build what the patent had described. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the firm continued, but the question that hung over every commission, every season, every retirement was the same question. When the last man who knew how to build a round action put down his tools, what happened next? There was no obvious answer. And for a period that stretched across the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the answer appeared to be nothing good. Production slowed to a pace that in any other trade would have been recognized as terminal decline. The guns still came out of the workshop. They still met the standard. But the gap between commissions lengthened. The workforce that remained was aging. The apprentices who might have been trained in the 1950s when the trade was already under pressure had in many cases gone elsewhere into engineering, into the expanding manufacturing sector, into trades that offered steadier wages and a clearer future than the bespoke gun-making workshop of a firm that produced in some years fewer than a dozen guns. The name survived. The address survived. The round action survived just. But by the early 1970s, John Dickson Son was in every practical sense a firm that existed on the momentum of its own history, rather than on the commercial foundations that history had once provided. The momentum, it turned out, was enough. Just. The firm that emerged from the 1970s was not the firm that had entered them. It was smaller. It was quieter. It carried the weight of 2 wars and 3 generations of fiscal attrition in every corner of the Frederick Street premises. But it was still there, and the round action was still being built by hands that had learned from hands, that had learned from the men who had stood beside the original craftsmen in the decades after the patent was granted. That continuity, unbroken, if at times barely sustained, is the fact that separates John Dickson Son from the majority of the Scottish gun-making trade, most of which did not survive the post-war contraction at all. The Edinburgh gun trade that had comprised a dozen working firms in the Edwardian period had by the 1980s contracted to a handful. Dickson was the last house still building guns of the original bespoke standard on the original mechanism in the original city. In the final decades of the 20th century, a series of ownership changes brought new capital to the firm without displacing its essential character. The round action continued to be produced not at Edwardian volumes and not at Edwardian prices adjusted merely for inflation, but at the prices that a gun of that rarity and that complexity commanded in a market that had by the 1990s begun to understand what it had nearly lost. A new Dickson round action gun commissioned in the early 21st century requires a waiting period measured in years rather than months. The production rate remains by necessity extremely limited. A function not of commercial choice, but of the irreducible time required to machine fit and regulate a mechanism that has no shortcuts and accepts no substitutions. Each gun passes through the hands of craftsmen who have served the full apprenticeship that the round action demands. The fitting of the action alone, the process of bringing the curved internal components to the tolerances at which the mechanism functions correctly, requires a standard of hand skill that cannot be accelerated by CNC machining or computer-aided design, though both are now used in the preparatory stages of production. The price of a new round action reflects that reality. Current commissions are quoted in the range that places Dickson alongside the first tier of London best guns in the company at last of Purdy and Holland not below them. The geographical hierarchy that had disadvantaged the Edinburgh firm for a century and a half has not disappeared entirely, but it has become irrelevant to the buyers who seek out the round action specifically. Those buyers do not come to Dickson because Edinburgh is cheaper than London. They come because the round action exists nowhere else. On the collector market, the pre-war Dickson round action occupies a position of unusual distinction. At Rock Island Auction Company, where original examples have appeared in specialist sporting arms sales documented pre-1914, round-action guns in original condition have commanded prices consistent with equivalent period London best guns, a parity that would have been unthinkable in the Edinburgh trade's own lifetime, when the London address alone commanded a premium that no Scottish maker could overcome. The Vintage Arms Association and the specialist British gun-making collector community have in recent decades produced detailed scholarship on the round action's mechanical history work that has drawn the attention of collectors who previously knew the name only in passing, if at all. Museum collections holding confirmed Dickson examples include the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, where the development of the Scottish gun-making trade is documented in the context of the broader industrial and craft history of the country. The Royal Armouries at Leeds holds related material on the British best gun tradition within which Dickson's work sits. For a collector wishing to examine a working round action in a private collection context, the annual fairs of the British Association for Shooting and Conservation and the specialist auction previews at Bonhams and Garrard have in recent years provided the most reliable points of access. What serious collectors say in private about the round action is this, that the balance of a well-stocked Dickson, the way the gun comes to the shoulder on a driven bird, is not replicable by any other action geometry currently in production. The curved receiver places the weight distribution at a point fractionally different from either the side lock or the box. Lock, a difference measurable in millimeters, perceptible in the fraction of a second between mounting the gun and pulling the trigger, and irrelevant to anyone who has not experienced it and decisive to anyone who has. Target shooters know this. Game shots who have used a round action in the field know it. They do not always say it in rooms where London makers are present. The surprise that the historical record preserves about John Dickson himself is not mechanical. It is philanthropic. In the 1850s and 1860s, at a period when the Edinburgh gun-making trade was generating sufficient income to allow for expenditure beyond the immediate needs of the workshop, Dickson contributed to the establishment and maintenance of a reading room and lending library facility accessible to the craftsmen and working families of the Frederick Street district, a form of civic investment that was not publicly credited to the firm and does not appear in any of the firm's own commercial literature of the period. It is recorded only in the Edinburgh civic records of the era in the context of the broader movement of artisan self-improvement societies that characterized the mid-Victorian Scottish urban trades. A gunmaker who built one of the most technically demanding sporting arms in British history also believed apparently that the men who built it deserved access to books. That detail does not appear on any of the guns. It does not need to. What John Dickson Son represents in the longer arc of British industrial and craft history is a proposition that the commercial geography of the 19th and 20th centuries consistently resisted, that the highest standard of a skilled trade does not require a London address to be real. The British best gun tradition produced its canonical names in Mayfair and on Oxford Street and in the ateliers of South Audley Street. It produced Purdy. It produced Holland and Holland. It produced Boss. Those names are not diminished by the addition of a fourth one that worked 330 miles to the north in a city that was never supposed to produce work of that standard filing patents that the London trade could not replicate, and building guns that the London trade in its more candid moments could not fault. The Edinburgh address still stands. The workshop still operates. The round action is still in production, machined from Sheffield steel, fitted by hand, stocked in English walnut, regulated on the pattern that was established in the patent of 1880 and has not required fundamental revision in the century and a half since. On a driven grouse day in Perthshire, on the same moors over the same ground, under the same August weather that John Dickson's first clients walked with his guns. 140 years ago, round action still opens cleanly at the breech, still ejects the spent case in the fraction of a second. The mechanism was designed to allow still closes with the solidity of fitted steel on fitted steel, and still carries on the action flat the name of the Edinburgh workshop that proved what a Scottish gunmaker could do. See you in the next one, music.